Warwick, Rhode Island, was the kind of town where time seemed to slow down. Mornings began with the gentle sound of lawnmowers, and at night, the silence was broken only by the distant sound of dogs or a car returning late from church. The neighbors knew each other by name. The children rode their bikes until dark, and no one imagined that anything bad could happen there. There was a false sense of invulnerability, as if that part of the world was protected by some invisible barrier that kept the chaos out. It was an almost cinematic calm, but even the quietest places hide cracks, and in Warwick, one was growing right in the center of the neighborhood. Liam Carter was, for all intents and purposes, just one of many teenagers in the city. He wore the same worn-out sneakers, laughed at the same silly jokes, had a notebook scribbled with random dreams and average grades. His mother, a dedicated woman, did the best she could. The father was more absent than present, which wasn't exactly unusual there. No one at his school or on the street where he lived could point out anything strange about him. He was polite, sociable, and sometimes even too kind. The kind of boy that many adults said was too calm to be difficult. But inside, Liam felt something no one saw, a growing detachment, a silent anger that had no name, only form. It was as if he carried an invisible bubble around him, a bubble that separated him from everything human. Sometimes he found himself watching people for long minutes without hearing a single word. It wasn't just shyness, it was disconnection. The impulses started small, quick and invasive thoughts, violent images that appeared during classes, a feeling that the world around was a simulation, something cold, with no real meaning. Liam tried to ignore it, tried to be normal. But as the days passed, the bubble tightened more. And with it came the desires. Desires that he could no longer control, but that he hid perfectly. After all, who would suspect such an ordinary boy? While others planned their summer vacation or laughed in the school hallways, Liam watched, learned patterns. I studied routines. I knew the times when houses were empty, the sounds that came from closed windows, the smell of fear in the night air. He didn't look like anyone you see on the news. He carried no weapons. I didn't draw weird things. It was just invisible. And perhaps that was what made him more dangerous, because when the bubble finally burst and whatever was inside escaped, there was no warning. There was no scream, just a sudden heavy silence that would take Warwick like a slow poison. And the city would never be the same again. It was late September when Warwick's tranquility began to unravel, although no one noticed right away. The night breeze was cool, the sky was clear, and the house lights went out one by one like any other ordinary night. But in one of these houses, a silent ritual was unfolding. Liam walked down the sidewalk, with the calm expression of someone returning from training or a grocery store. He wore gloves. He wore a hoodie that covered his arms up to the wrist. No neighbors noticed him, and even if they had noticed, they wouldn't have found it strange. He was the good boy, invisible in the crowd, invisible enough to do what he did without arousing suspicion. The chosen house was not random. It was close, familiar. It was where a middle-aged woman lived, alone since her children moved away. Liam knew. The backyard, the way the back door made a little click before it opened. I knew where the light breaker was. I knew she slept early. The plan had been drawn up calmly in silence for weeks. When he entered the house, there was no hesitation, just precision. The details of what happened inside were never fully revealed by the police, and perhaps out of respect for the family, or the degree of brutality involved. But the fact is that that night, Liam stopped being just an invisible boy. It became something different, something no one wanted to believe could exist. The next morning, the city woke up to the sound of sirens. The news spread like wildfire in a dry brush. A crime had occurred, and in Warwick, It was almost inconceivable. People began to gather in front of the house, in silence, trying to understand what could have happened. The police were visibly shaken, the officers' faces tense, their eyes downcast. No arrests had been made, no clues released, and the fear began to set in. It wasn't just the tragic loss of a life. It was the feeling that something was wrong there, something that broke with logic, with normality. An invisible tremor that grew in the corners of the city. Liam, in turn, went to school the next day. He sat in the same chair, answered the call, participated in science class. He looked out the window as he always did. But inside him, something had changed forever. The bubble had burst. And instead of guilt, he felt a strange relief. A calm that bordered on pleasure. It had not been discovered. Nobody suspected. The feeling of impunity was mixed with a new form of power. He was no longer just a boy trying to fit in. Now he knew what he was capable of, and that left him hungry for more. The days following the crime dragged on like collective mourning. There was no music in the streets, no children playing in the yard. People whispered in the markets, tightened the door locks, and looked twice before turning off the lights at night. Fear was a new and unwelcome visitor to Warwick. Meanwhile, Liam observed everything with the coldness of someone who had caused chaos and was now analyzing its consequences. He walked among the others like a spectator of a film he had written. And the more he saw the despair of his neighbors, the more he felt in control. Nobody suspected him, and that made him drunk. At home, her routine seemed set in stone. He ate with his mother, pretended to laugh, talked about schoolwork. But at night, locked in his room, he mentally relived every detail of the night of the crime. The sound, the smell, the gestures. It was as if he was watching it all over again, but with pride, as if every memory was a secret trophy kept just for him. Liam showed no remorse or even fear of being caught. On the contrary, there was a growing self-confidence in him, a silent arrogance of someone who believes he will never be discovered. And this certainty drove him to move forward, like an addiction that only feeds with repetition. The police, on the other hand, were collapsing. The investigations continued without a clear direction. No witnesses, no suspects, no signs of forced entry. It was as if the killer had entered and left the house without leaving a trace. The city demanded answers, but investigators knew they were looking at something unusual. It didn't seem like an impulse crime, nor a common invasion. There was method. There was coldness. It was personal, but calculated. Authorities began to consider the possibility that the perpetrator was not an outsider, but an insider. Someone who knew the details. And this increased the collective panic even more. Meanwhile, Liam was already choosing his next victim. The idea did not come as an elaborate plan, but as an urgency, an impulse that grew every day. He saw the frightened faces of his neighbors. He knew he could do it again, even better, cleaner, more efficient, and at the same time, more intense. The danger didn't stop him, it excited him. In his mind, it was like a game where each new move had to be more audacious than the last. But what he didn't know was that the more he risked, the more he attracted attention. And little by little, the cracks in the mask began to appear. Few months passed before Warwick plunged once and for all into his greatest tragedy. It was a sultry summer night when Liam Carter walked through the gate of the house next door, where a woman and her 2 young daughters lived. He already knew their routine. Dinner time, the time when the lights went out, the sound of the television at low volume before bed. There was something meticulous about his behavior, as if he were repeating a ritual. But that night, something was different. Liam no longer seemed curious or cautious. He was filled with a cruel certainty, an impulse that I no longer controlled, and that I wanted to repeat on a larger scale. What happened inside was described by investigators as one of the most brutal acts they had ever witnessed. There were no signs of forced entry, but the scene was one of total devastation. The violence was so extreme that the police thought the attack had been committed by multiple people. The victims, a mother and two school-aged daughters, were found in their bedrooms, and the way they were attacked suggested fury but also coldness. There was logic to the brutality, as if Liam wanted to not just eliminate, but assert some kind of dominance, something that he couldn't achieve in normal life, but that there, in the silence of that house, he finally took for himself. The city stopped. Schools suspended classes. The news invaded the tranquility of Warwick with helicopters and cameras. Reporters crowded the sidewalks, trying to understand what could have caused such horror. Who could do something like that, was the constant question, and the scariest thing was that no one had an answer. The police were now working with the possibility of a serial killer, but they never imagined that this killer could only be 13 years old. It was a possibility so far from logical that no one dared to consider it, and Liam once again watched everything as a spectator. Only this time, the pleasure of watching was even greater. At home, he maintained the same well-behaved smile. He came home from school, did his homework, had dinner with his mother. All eyes were on the adult predator the police were looking for. No one imagined that the monster was right there, sleeping in a room with posters on the wall, video games on the floor, and a school bag leaning against the chair. But what Liam didn't yet know was that the impact of the latest crime had created deep ripples, and that these waves, no matter how invisible he thought he was, would start knocking on his door, not with screams, but with silence. The same silence that, until then, had always protected him. The succession of crimes left deep marks on Warwick. Fear turned into hysteria. Parents picked up their children early from school, surveillance groups began to form, and every strange face seemed like a threat. But while chaos ensued outside, inside Liam Carter's mind, something different was happening. He didn't feel cornered. He felt superior. The feeling of control was intoxicating. Seeing adults fall apart over something he had silently caused gave him a warped sense of power. But with this pleasure also came recklessness, and that's when he started making mistakes. The first slip-up wasn't big, but enough to raise an alarm in one of the case's most experienced investigators. During an informal interview at school, a police officer noticed something in Liam's eyes, an almost proud gleam when he mentioned the crimes, even if in a subtle way. It wasn't fear nor discomfort. It was something that only attentive eyes would notice. The agent wrote down the name, even without having proof. Days later, new contradictions emerged. Liam seemed to know too, many details, to have heard things that hadn't yet been disclosed. Small signs, subtle, but dangerous for those who wanted to remain invisible. At the same time, tension within the house increased. Liam's mother, although loving, began to notice changes in his behavior. He slept less, was silent for long periods, and once she found him obsessively cleaning the soles of his shoes, even though they were clean. She thought it was strange, but attributed it to the stress of adolescence. The truth is that, no matter how much he tried to maintain the facade, Liam was beginning to be swallowed by his own arrogance. The line between self-control and chaos was blurring, and the eyes around, previously inattentive, were now more open than ever. One day, an anonymous call led the researchers to ask more incisive questions. Small DNA samples were collected in secret from objects in the Carter home, and from then on, the siege began to close. Liam, however, still believed he was above it all. It was a game, and he still thought he had the pieces in his hand. But what he didn't imagine was that the end of the board was closer than ever, and when the truth came out, there would be no more running away, No more pretending that everything was just a distant thought. The city he controlled through fear was about to discover what was hiding behind the smiling boy. When the police knocked on the Carter home's door, Liam's world cracked like glass under pressure. He tried to remain calm, but the expression on his face was registered by everyone present. Surprise, then anger, and finally, a frightening emptiness. The evidence was irrefutable. Genetic fragments, marks compatible with the crime scene, and, most disturbing, notes in a notebook hidden among the school pages, where he described his actions in details that had never been disclosed. There was nowhere else to run. And for the first time, Warwick saw the face of someone who had turned his days into sleepless nights. A boy. A childish face, a soulless look. Liam's trial was not simple. The commotion was national. Protests called for justice. Others questioned how someone so young could have committed such an atrocity. Psychologists, lawyers, and experts tried to decipher his mind, but many came away even more confused. Liam didn't cry. He didn't apologize. He spoke about the crimes with an icy detachment. He said he remembered every detail, but never expressed regret. When asked if he understood the gravity of what he had done, he simply nodded without emotion. It was as if the deaths had been just part of an experiment that he wanted to carry out until the end, an experiment where lives were the price. Due to his age at the time of the crimes, the judicial system faced ethical and legal dilemmas. The legislation did not allow life imprisonment for minors in cases like that. This generated outrage. Emergency reforms were proposed, and ultimately, through other offenses committed while already detained, Liam was remanded in custody. Today, he remains incarcerated, isolated. But the legacy of horror he left was not locked away with him. It still echoes. His name has become a symbol of a flawed system, a deceitful innocence, and the most terrifying fact of all, evil has no age and can smile at you at any time. Stories like Liam Carter's are not told for sensationalism, but as a warning, to reflect on what we ignore, on the signs we don't see, and on what we hide behind the good boy appearance. If this story impacted you in any way, I invite you to give it a like. It's a small gesture, but it helps this content reach more people. Leave your opinion in the comments. Do you think someone like that can change? Should I have a second chance? And of course, if you haven't signed up yet, now is the time. Activate the bell so you don't miss any new stories like this. Because, as painful as they are, some truths need to be told. And you being here is already a step towards not letting them